the election's over, then the commentary will change its tone. Well, to the female panel, they need no introduction. Two very able political figures, Sen Fierravanti-Wells, always on top of her stuff, and Tanya Plibersek. The prospect of her becoming federal Labor leader frightens the tripe out of Liberal supporters. I should stress these ladies have no prior notice of the questions, except that I did raise with them last week this Biosecurity Act, which you want to go back to briefly, biosecurity. Conchetta, thank you for your time. You spoke last week in the Parliament about this Biosecurity Act with sweeping powers to ban Australian citizens. You said the laws were exempt from disallowance, and if the ban, the citizen dared return, imprisonment or a fine. What I found staggering was you telling us that parliamentarians are prevented from scrutinising such an act or disallowing its powers. Now, you're the chair of the Senate Standing Committee on the scrutiny of delegated legislation. Shouldn't all legislation be subject to rigorous parliamentary scrutiny?
Alan, absolutely it should. And just to put this into context, there are approximately 2,000 pieces of legislation every year. Half of those are actually acts of parliament. The other half is executive-made law, delegated legislation, of which 20% is exempt from scrutiny. And so, absolutely, Alan, and this was the reason why our committee decided that the growing trend of exempting legislation from scrutiny deserved to be inquired into, and we had an inquiry. And indeed, Alan, when you do have a situation where you've got people like Professor George Williams, Professor Anne Toomey, Kim Carr, myself and the IPA on the same page, then you know that you have an issue of concern.
There's no doubt about that. I don't think the public understand this. Tanya, welcome to the program. These measures are brought in as regulations at the behest of a single parliamentarian, namely the minister. And as Conchetta said in the Parliament, encroach upon individual rights and liberties. Isn't parliamentary oversight all the more important?
Well, it's absolutely vital, Alan. You're quite right, Connie's quite right, that there should be parliamentary oversight of this sort of legislation. And I think there's two things really to say about this particular piece of legislation. Yes, the Parliament should have the opportunity to debate it. But secondly, even the Prime Minister himself said, when he announced it, it was in a press release, and there was a bit of pushback through the media. And then the next day, the Prime Minister said, oh, no, well, it's unlikely that we'll ever use this legislation.
Yes,
well,
that's right.
I don't know why you would announce such a thing, put out a press release, and then 24 hours later say it's not going to be used. I think really the whole thing was an effort to distract from the mess that the quarantine and vaccine rollout have been.
Well, Conchetta, I think Tanya's got a point, because the Prime Minister then said, when the public belled the cat and said, this is just absurd, he said, no, it won't happen. This is a media beat-up. It's the media. The fact is the powers are there and they were executed by Minister Hunt. So there's no beat-up about it. It was a reality, wasn't it?
Well, the provisions of 477, Section 477, pursuant to which the Governor-General made a determination of a human pandemic, has been there since 2015. The section relevant to the imprisonment of 5 years and the fine were there since the inception of the Act. Now, whether at the time, and regrettably, like sometimes in Parliament, it doesn't get the scrutiny that it should have had. And this is the reason why we examined the Biosecurity Act and recommended that the government make all determinations under the Biosecurity Act subject to
But haven't you recommended, didn't you recommend in December, your committee, that these powers should not be exempt from disallowance? So am I led to believe that the government ignored you?
Well, we put out an interim report and a final report. We are awaiting the government's response to that. But on a practical move, there is a motion before the Senate to be debated on the 16th of June, where our committee recommends that all delegated legislation be subject to scrutiny, and only in rare and exceptional circumstances ought it not be. But in addition,
Tanya, quickly on that. Tanya, would the Labor Party agree with
Alan,
that?
Look, I haven't seen the legislation and we'll debate it in our normal way through our normal processes. But Alan, I'm just going back to something you said about the Prime Minister saying this was a media beat-up, the fact that it was reported in this way. If you put out a press release and the media reports it, that's not a media beat-up, that's journalists doing their job.
Just let's come back to this aged care thing. Conchetta, $17.7 billion in the budget over 5 years for aged care, not even indexed. It will not meet the shortfall in home care before you start on residential aged care. Does the government understand that this is a potential political time bomb? Conchetta?
Well, Alan, I am very concerned, and yes, more money is welcome, but it is not the structural reform that was hoped for by the sector. And I know that whilst it has been welcome, that the additional money, it is certainly, in my view, what has happened is that there will be more augmented powers to existing structures, but we are not going to see the sort of reforms, certainly that Commissioner Pagoni
that the 148
advocated.
recommendations recommended. Tanya, the government admits there's an 80,000 waiting list for home care places. I think, and my information is it's higher than that. The Royal Commission said this deficit in available places must be addressed immediately. The budget papers provide for 40,000 places this year and 40,000 next year. That's not what the Royal Commission recommended. What are your party going to do about that?
No, and we'll keep calling on the government to actually address the truth of the waiting list for home care. Most people want to stay in their own homes as long as they can, and they can do that safely with a bit of extra help. But, Alan, in the last couple of years, 27,000 people have died waiting for the home care that they've been approved
Big
for.
issue, this.
So this isn't people who may or may not be eligible. They have been determined to be eligible and they have died waiting for care that didn't come. That is shocking. And
this is a massive issue.
You and Conchetta make, it is a massive issue because people want to stay in their own homes when they can. But the other point that Connie made that's quite right is that this extra money, of course it's welcome, but it doesn't have the reform that we need. So you spend extra money, does it go to higher wages for the workforce?
Or more staff.
They are saints,
or more
the people
staff.
that do this work. More staff. Does it go to better food? We know that about half
the money isn't there. Tanya, the money isn't there. The money, it won't even touch the sides. See, Conchetta, the providers are in hopeless deficit. This is in now the retirement homes, hopeless deficit. The money's not indexed. And I've read reports from reputable industry surveys which argue that for the financial year 2020 alone, the residential aged care sector will be in deficit of, quote, and these are the government's own figures, up to $1 billion. I mean, this money's not there in the budget. What's going to happen?
Well, Alan, that is precisely the reason why this is not an issue just about money, and it is about reforming and thinking about the long-term sustainability of the sector, which is really what I would have liked to have seen. And I've been engaged with the aged care sector now for 40 years and we've had over 20 inquiries and they've all said the same thing. And as Commissioner Pagoni said, if you do the same thing, you're going to get the same results. And that's the issue that we face. And I have to say that some of the workforce issues, I personally am in favour of resident to staff ratios. I think the time has come for us to have that serious discussion about those ratios and most especially about the wages in aged care.
No doubt about it. See, Tanya, just finally, and we'll resume this next week, but the figures I've cited tonight are from the government's own ACFA. This is the Aged Care Financial Authority. I just want to ask you one quick question for a quick answer. Where is the Labor Party on this? I mean, this, I think, is a political time bomb.
Well, I think, Alan, it's fair to say there wouldn't have been a Royal Commission without Labor Party advocacy. We've been working with the workers and the residents in the sector, people who are advocating for change, to actually hold the government to account. Don't forget, when Scott Morrison was Treasurer, he cut billions of dollars from aged care. This is the result, and we'll continue to pursue the government because older Australians deserve a fair deal.
Definitely. Well, to get that fair deal, I mean, this kind of discussion is really important. We'll resume it next week. Thank you both for your time and for your input.
Thanks,
Tanya Plibersek, Conchetta Fierravanti-Wells. Back after the break to wrap it all up.